Hey everyone, thanks for sticking around. I'm excited to share with you some interesting work we're doing and get input from all of you on generating consistent demand for environmental assets. Slides will come up in a minute here. I'll just start riffing. So most of you are probably familiar with carbon credits if you're hanging around in these circles. Carbon credits are one example of a broader class of asset that's often referred to as environmental asset, ecosystem service asset. And the general idea is that people want to fund climate action, they want to fund sustainable activities, but not everyone wants to get a shovel and start planting trees or installing renewable energy. So the question is, how can we incentivize people to carry out the activities we need to carry out to mitigate the climate crisis without necessarily directly doing that ourselves? So the mechanism that I'm going to talk about today is the voluntary carbon market, but you should think of this as one example of a sort of broader class of assets that can be developed. And a lot of the same principles will apply regardless of whether we're talking about carbon or plastic or watershed restoration. Still not getting any slides, but I think they're working on that. So the first thing I want to frame is like the scale of the problem. We need to substantially reduce emissions as soon as possible. The targets are somewhere around 50% by 2030 in order to avoid more than 1.5 degrees C of warming. So that's quite an urgent situation. On the other hand, we have a massive debt of carbon already up in the atmosphere that needs to be drawn down. So the sort of two sides of this coin are avoidance credits and removal credits. Avoidance will help us speed that transition to reducing emissions, while removal credits will give us the long-term ability to manage the carbon debt that's up in the atmosphere. Okay, here we go. So this is just a demonstration visually of what I was just talking about. So you can see we need that 50% reduction by 2030 to get to 1.5, and we also need substantial negative emissions, and that's the red line there. The key thing I want to point out here is that negative emissions are basically zero right now. We have very low levels of removals being done. The tech is still being developed, capital is still being deployed, whereas we need to reduce emissions substantially as quickly as possible. So this sort of setup is in the next, say, 5 to 10 years, we need to be substantially reducing emissions while we develop the technology to do large-scale removals. So in terms of like the carbon markets in general, there's some challenges, but there's also a lot of potential. You might think, oh, well, are carbon credits just for greenwashing? My point here is that there's an underlying financial technology that people with money who want to fund climate action can allocate that money to project developers on the ground actually doing the work. And the UN is very clear in the latest IPCC report, there really isn't a pathway to 1.5C that doesn't involve large-scale removals. And the only mechanism we have right now for funding large-scale removals is the voluntary carbon market, of which I'll be showing more in a minute. So yeah, I don't think carbon credits are just for greenwashing, even though historically they've often been used by large corporations for greenwashing. So I just want to give a brief overview of the different types of carbon credit projects. This isn't super important for the breakout session, but it'll give us some context. Basically, we have reductions and removals. Reductions also known as avoidances. Basically, a reduction is going to prevent emissions in the first place. A removal is going to take down carbon that's already been emitted. And the key thing here is that it's not really an either or, in my opinion. It's really a both and. We both need to substantially reduce emissions as quickly as possible and long-term draw down carbon from the atmosphere. So short-term, I would expect, and this is sort of the reality, that most of the credits on the market today are avoidance. And in the future, those avoidance credits will cap out. There's only so much renewable energy to install, only so much existing forest to protect, whereas removal credits have a much more, a higher theoretical limit of how much removals we can do. And so we would expect that removals will scale up, avoidance will scale down over the coming decades. So just to sort of get a sense of the scale we need here, we need to increase the scale of the traditional VCM by 15 to 20x in the next 10 years or so. Right now, we've generated about 1 billion tons of carbon credits ever. We need to do that every year for the next like 20 years to address the crisis. Okay, so how does the VCM work? I don't want to spend too much time on this. If you have any questions, please come up after during the breakout. But basically, you have suppliers who are the project developers, and then you have the buyers. And traditionally, those buyers are corporations. Because even though there's a lot of exciting stuff going on the supply side, a lot of new methodologies being developed for the issuance of credits, the reality is that if we 10x the supply today, prices will collapse because there's simply not enough consistent demand for the underlying asset to meet the scale up of supply that we anticipate coming in the next few years. So what I want to talk about today is basically scaling the VCM by migrating on chain. There's a lot of unique benefits we can solve in the traditional market by bringing it on chain. But the big one that is going to be relevant for our discussion today is programmability. So we can take these tokenized carbon credits and we can use them in novel ways that wouldn't be possible in a traditional sort of SQL and email going back and forth on the phone mechanism of sourcing, which is what we see in the traditional VCM. Okay, so the actual subject of the talk and what I want to talk about in the breakout session today is how we scale the VCM. So there's a really strong imbalance in the traditional VCM. In particular, there's always people selling. There's always suppliers who want to offload their credits, and the buyers only come around once in a while. So the way it's been described to me by some traders who operate in the space is that there are constant offers. Everyone wants to sell, and very few bids. The bids come around kind of few and far between. When a corporation shows up that's not correlated one-to-one with like a corporate offsetting initiative, but is really driven by economic activity on chain. So that's one example. This is just sort of a walkthrough. You can go to the advanced settings in SushiSwap on sushi.com, and you can try this out yourself. So that's one example. Another great example is live events like this one we're all here today. I want to point to SBS, Sustainable Blockchain Summit. They're doing a lot of really cool work developing sort of community-driven offsetting approach for their event. Live events have this really nice characteristic that they recur every year. At least they usually do. And so there's going to be this sort of consistent demand if we can fill the calendar with live events that are offsetting their own emissions. That creates a much more consistent demand. And the reality is, like, we all value live events, right? We're all here. And so this is unavoidable emissions. We can reduce the use of plastic. We can travel by train or car instead of air. But ultimately, people want to travel for live events. So we should be capturing that and using it to drive demand for retirements. Another interesting opportunity that we're working with a couple of companies on at Klima is basically when you purchase a durable good or a consumer good, that a portion of your purchase price will go toward retiring carbon, not necessarily in a one-to-one offsetting approach, but where like a portion of your purchase is going to be set aside, held in some yield-bearing asset like the Klima token or USDC, and then the yield will be retired on an ongoing basis throughout the life cycle of that product. So let's say you buy a diamond ring, right? That diamond ring has some carbon embodied in it, and the longer you wear that diamond ring, sort of the more use value you're getting out of it. And the idea is that diamond rings last a long time, so you want to be perpetually offsetting rather than offsetting once at production. Again, creating that consistent demand. Consumer packaged goods is another opportunity we're looking at. It's a little bit less straightforward, but a lot of CPG companies want to market their sustainable activities in a more direct way. So rather than having a 45-page PDF document on their website, you might have a QR code on every bottle of, I don't know, Coca-Cola, where you scan the QR code and you can see the specific projects that are being supported by the carbon credits consumed to mitigate the emissions of that production. Okay, another really interesting one that's already being used in the traditional VCM is online bookings. So you have airlines that will give you the option when you're booking to offset the carbon emissions from your flight. We think this can be generalized to things like hotel bookings, rental car bookings, by basically building a little API that the bookings companies like bookings.com, lastminute.com, all these online travel agencies can hook into and easily calculate and offer tokenized carbon credits to their users. Okay, it's frozen, but that's pretty much it. There's one other interesting example. We're integrating with Lens protocol to make it so that when you collect a post on the Lens protocol, you can send, instead of money, sending a carbon credit retirement to the creator of that post. So it's a nice sort of a way of paying for something in a non-monetary form, right? You're basically offsetting carbon on behalf of someone else and to pay them for the work that they've done. Okay, I'm going to cut it there. Thank you all for listening. I'm going to be over here. But what I really like is for us to talk about new ways that we can drive demand for environmental assets, because all the great work in the world being done by lots of people here to build environmental assets will be for naught if we don't have demand for those assets. Thanks, everyone.